Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Interim Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In today's broadcast, we'll be discussing the threat posed by the Islamic State and critiquing President Obama's plan to combat the group in Iraq and Syria. Our experts today include Sandy Hodgkinson, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who will be joining us from Washington, D.C.'s NPR studio. She will be joined there with Paul Williams, one of the world's foremost peace negotiators, who just returned from peace talks in Yemen. Here in Cleveland, at the WCPN Idea Stream studio, I'm joined by international law expert Milena Stereo, who is the Associate Dean of the Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and by ethicist Shannon French, who heads the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University. Let's begin our discussion with Sandy Hodgkinson. Sandy, I need some background so that I can understand exactly how we got to this point and what we're dealing with. Can you tell us a little bit about the Islamic State, this group which has all these different names, ISIS and ISIL? Well, let's start by asking you, why so many names?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks very much, Michael, for having me on the show today. I'm really delighted to be here. Well, there are obviously a couple different names that have been used, all in reference to the same group and the same enemy that we are now launching airstrikes to try to rout out. But the first one, ISIS, which is the one that, was originally being used more frequently in the media, is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So that basically references just the geographic constraint of this terrorist organization that exists in Iraq and Syria that had moved over from originally what was just in Iraq. The State Department and the President have used it more broadly under the term Islamic State in Levant, or ISIL. Levant is a regional description that the State Department has traditionally used for the region that includes generally Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. So it's a broader historical reference to the particular region of which Iraq and Syria now encompass. So that is the term that the President has used, and that is the term that the U.S. government is currently using.
Now, when you talk about the Islamic State, I mean, there's really two different branches of Islam, the Shia and the Sunni. Which branch are these militants from?
These militants are Sunni, and I want to talk a minute about exactly what the Islamic State is. The Islamic State is actually a term used by the organization itself, somewhat descriptive of what their ultimate goal is, which is to eventually create a caliphate or a state that's led by a supreme religious and political leader known as a caliph. That is the goal of the organization, and so when they refer to themselves as the Islamic State, it really is an effort to try to give themselves credibility as something much bigger and candidly more legitimate than what they are as a terrorist organization.
Well, is their goal beyond the bounds of Iraq and Syria?
Certainly. Their goal is broader within the region and to establish as large of an Islamic State as they can.
Okay, so this group began as an outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And you were there in Iraq a decade ago as senior counsel to the occupation forces. How did the Iraqi al-Qaeda morph into this new entity?
Well, first it began, obviously as the lack of security in Iraq continued to grow and al-Qaeda in Iraq continued to get larger and larger, it ultimately merged in with other groups to form what was then known as the ISI, or the Islamic State in Iraq. So it was contained more geographically to Iraq at the time. It wasn't until about 2013 that it started to move over into Syria, taking advantage of the civil war and the instability there, and started to change its name to include the broader reference to Syria, or as they refer to themselves, al-Sham.
And meanwhile, Sandy, in Syria, there's this other al-Qaeda group, the al-Nusra. Is that right?
Yes, there is.
So now we have competing al-Qaeda groups. Is that the essence of what's going on there?
Well, yes. Al-Nusra has as its goal, it's formed in Syria during the civil war, and it has principally the goal of trying to have an Islamic State mostly in Syria. The broader goal of ISIL is a goal to have a broader caliphate state that is more expansive than just in Syria alone. So they have similar goals, but different objectives at the end of the day.
All right, so what should we be calling them throughout this broadcast? The Islamic State, the ISIL, the
We should be
ISIL
calling
or
them,
IS? Yeah, go ahead.
we should be calling them ISIL.
Okay.
ISIL, because that is right now where we're referencing the military airstrikes, and the purpose of the current U.S. government policy is focused on coming up with a solution to ISIL. And while al-Nusra continues to exist in Syria, it's not part of the legitimate purpose of these airstrikes. And while there are other terms that are used for it, ISIL and ISIL seem to be as broadly representative of the actions that the U.S. government will probably take to address it.
How many militant troops are there in this organization?
Well, it's been a number that has continued to grow. I mean, at first we heard that it was a couple thousand, and then, now there are reports that it's 20 to 30,000 different fighters. And we're seeing an increase in fighters coming from other Western countries as well, in Europe particularly. And now the count of Western fighters as part of ISIL has grown to about 3,000. Okay,
so why in the world would someone sitting in the United Kingdom or the United States go halfway around the world to join this militant group?
Well, it's this declaration of a so-called caliphate, or this idea that there could be something bigger like an Islamic State that's more representative and larger than itself. It appeals to radicals that are living in those areas, and so they see it gaining strength, they see it gaining territory, and it's attractive to people who are more radical in those areas.
Well, where are they getting all their money and their arms?
Well, the largest amount of money that they've been getting has been from taking control of oil refineries in Iraq and Syria. And they've taken control of numerous oil refineries and smuggled the oil out for international sales. So they've made most of their money off of that. But in addition to that, they've also looted different Iraqi arms caches. They've robbed the Iraqi central bank and got another $425 million from there. There's also reports of private funders that have been existing for a long time that continue to play a role in the background from international sources as well. So they are right now estimated to have about $2 billion in assets by most media sources, which is a lot of money to help carry out this kind of asymmetric warfare.
Well, Sandy, what can you tell us about their leader? This is Abu Bakr Baghdadi.
Right. Well, what we know about him is that he was born back in 1971 in Iraq. So he's an Iraqi citizen who grew up there and has degrees from the Islamic University of Baghdad. But after the invasion of Iraq, he really helped forming the leading terrorist opposition group there in Iraq. He did spend a little bit of time as a civilian internee held by DoD forces at Camp Bucca. And he's continued to gain strength in opposition there in Iraq over the years since then. When Osama bin Laden was killed, he put out a statement that stated that it was his responsibility and the responsibility of other like-minded individuals to seek retaliation for that death. And so he has continued to gain over time in his struggle to seize power and to become more influential in this desire to become a caliph of this self-proclaimed state.
So he has his terrorist cred. Would you say he's also a very charismatic figure?
Well, certainly he is. I mean, you can't rise to authority in this type of media world unless you actually have the ability to do that. And by calling himself, again, a so-called caliph and trying to create a self-proclaimed state or something that is greater, he's basically making himself part of the storyline of why people should follow him. So you require some charisma to do this.
So let's bring Paul Williams into this conversation. Paul is the president of a Nobel Peace Prize nominated NGO called the Public International Law and Policy Group. And Paul, I know you've just gotten off the plane literally yesterday from Yemen, where you were serving as the legal advisor for the peace negotiations, which seem to have successfully worked there. Welcome back to the States.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what I need to ask you, Paul, is it's really interesting that you've just come back from Yemen, because President Obama has compared what he'd like to achieve in Syria in particular and also in Iraq with respect to ISIL with the success that he perceives has broken out in Yemen. Do you see a comparison?
There's a comparison, Michael, but it's not the same comparison that the president is making. It's actually a very scary comparison. Our success against al-Qaeda in Yemen has been quite limited. It's essentially degraded their capacity and kept them distracted from planning any serious attacks on the United States or carrying out those attacks. But it has not substantially degraded, and it has certainly not destroyed al-Qaeda. And what's important is in Yemen, the U.S. government is working hand in hand with the government of Yemen, which has ground troops which have been trained by the United States, and we're still only able to make moderate success. The plan that he has for dealing with ISIL does not include, at this moment, partnering with forces as capable as the Yemeni ground forces. Of course, those forces would be the Syrian opposition, but there's been very, very weak cooperation between the U.S. government and the Syrian opposition at this point. So I'm worried if Yemen is his model.
All right, and let me ask you the big picture here, Paul. Sandy has given us some great background, and I feel like I understand where this group came from and how it's gotten all of its power. But do you see this organization as a serious threat to the United States?
Yes.
Okay, tell us why.
Think back to what Sandy said. Sandy said this is an outgrowth of al-Qaeda, which has $2 billion and has territory. So think of this as an amped up, a supercharged al-Qaeda. It still has the mission of original al-Qaeda, which is to cause harm to the United States interest, and to American citizens. Now think of that, as Sandy had said, $2 billion. Think of them as well-armed. They have over 1,500 American-made Humvees that they captured from Iraq. They have scores of tanks. They have a tremendous number of light weapons and artillery. They have an amazing marketing plan, much better than most governments' marketing plans. And they are able to attract foreign fighters with American and European passports. This is what's scary. You take al-Qaeda and you multiply it many, many, many times. And this is what we're facing.
Whoa, that's scary stuff, Paul. And I know some people blame President Obama for the rise of the ISIL, specifically for his failure to negotiate a status of forces agreement with Iraq. How do you see that situation?
Well, Michael, there are 4 key mistakes that President Obama has made in dealing with this evolving situation. And the reality is 3 of these are ongoing mistakes. So first of all, he failed to negotiate a status of forces agreement with Iraq, which would have allowed the United States to keep a few thousand Americans in Iraq. If they were there, they may not have been able to prevent the seizure of this massive amount of equipment, but they could have certainly called in airstrikes to destroy that equipment before it was seized by ISIL. 3 other major mistakes that he's making. First of all,
Paul, let's stop here for a minute so that we can take a short break. And when we come back, you can tell us about the 3 other mistakes that have led to the situation. So everybody, stay tuned and come right back. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and WCPN 90.3 Idea Stream. I'm Michael Scharf, the Interim Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're talking today about combating the militant group known as the Islamic State, or ISIL. Our expert panel includes former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Sandy Hodgkinson, Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Professor Milena Stereo of Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and Dr. Shannon French from Case Western's Inamori International Center for Ethics. Just before the break, Paul was telling us about how he sees President Obama's blame for getting us in the situation where the Islamic State has become such a threat. And Paul had just described the number 1 reason, but Paul, you said there were 3 others. Can you continue?
Yes. We failed in the last 3 years of the Syrian conflict to literally take the field, to be engaged, to lead, to defend the people of Syria against the rampages of President Assad. Because we didn't take the field, we chose to ignore it, al-Qaeda took the field. And it has used the rallying cry of protecting the Syrians from President Assad to build ISIL, to build their caliphate, to gain territory. And now they're turning it against the people of Syria and against the people of Iraq. To a degree, we're still failing to take the field by only having, quite frankly, limited airstrikes over these past few weeks. The second and the gravest mistake is that we are not taking on President Assad. You have ISIL in the region because President Assad is committing crimes against humanity, brutal acts against his own people. We will not defeat ISIL until we remove one of the core reasons for being, which is to stop Assad. We've been clear that we're not fighting him. That is wrong. We need to engage. And the third important reason is we need to work with the Syrian opposition coalition. We haven't done it seriously in the last 3 years, and we're not doing it seriously now. The only important government in the region not to be notified of these airstrikes was the Syrian opposition, the moderate rebels. The only group not to be consulted about this operation were the moderate rebels, our allies, our perceived boots on the ground. Those are 3 mistakes that we must reverse and not continue.
Now, before we start to critique the plan that President Obama has launched, I want to turn to Shannon French, our ethicist, and ask a little bit about what we're seeing as the strategy of this terrorist organization, where they're broadcasting videos of beheadings. I mean, what are they trying to accomplish with that? It almost seems like they're trying to draw us into the fighting.
Well, in a word, no. They don't want powers like the U.S. and the U.K. Pulled into a shooting war. That's not to their advantage. However, what they have is an incredible opportunity for PR and for fundraising. We focus on the fact that in these horrifying cases where the journalists have been beheaded, the countries involved have refused to pay, like, again, the U.S. and the U.K. But we can't forget in the background there have been other hostage cases where countries have paid. So part of what's going on is if you want to force the hand or increase your power against groups that will pay, beheading citizens of countries that don't pay is a way to make a statement.
So this is basically their business model, is what
A
you're
little
saying.
bit, yeah, but it's much broader than just raising funds, and it's a small portion of their fundraising compared to, as we heard earlier, oil and so forth. But the bigger part is on the PR and recruitment side. This is an incredible way to thumb their noses at the West, and I mean that in the strongest, actually, possible way, because it's a rejection of Western values. It's saying whatever power you may think you have, we can kill your citizens. It actually isn't relevant that they're journalists or who they are individually as people to them. It is that they represent these powers, and they are trying to diminish the appearance of the reputation of those powers.
Well, it may have been a miscalculation because the American people don't seem to like to see those images. And I think that is what emboldened the White House to take the steps that they have. And I want to turn now to Melina Stereo. We haven't forgotten you there, our international law expert. Can you walk us through President Obama's comprehensive plan for dealing with the ISIL threat?
Sure, Michael. The president's strategy essentially has 3 prongs. First, we're going to use American air power. So we've already begun a systematic campaign of airstrikes against the ISIL. Second, we're going to use surrogate military troops on the ground, and Paul already alluded to this. We're going to use groups such as, for example, the Syrian moderates. We're not going to use American ground forces. We're going to use these other surrogates. And then third, we're going to obtain, hopefully, help from a coalition of states. So we're going to work with a coalition of states on matters such as, for example, obtaining increased intelligence information, humanitarian aid, other types of assistance. And so it's a 3-pronged strategy that, as we'll discuss here today, may or may not work.
Yeah, I like how you broke that up. That makes it easier for me to get my head around. And let's start with the first prong. Let's take these one at a time. So the press has reported that the United States has been using Tomahawk cruise missiles and also bombings from F-22 aircraft. This is not at all the pinprick kind of strikes you get from these Predator drones, that they've been using against the terrorists in the past. This is major munitions, right?
Sure.
Okay, so the LA Times recently described President Obama's strategy for defeating the Islamic State as whack-a-mole. You guys know that, right? That game
Yes.
that you play in the arcades where you hit the thing and it keeps coming back up. So let's turn to Sandy and Paul. Sandy and Paul, what do you think? Is this going to work? This kind of whack-a-mole strategy? Sandy, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Certainly, the whack-a-mole strategy can be a starting step for any kind of a scaled strategy for addressing a threat like this. But it's really questionable as to how much more you need to do and how quickly. It certainly can be a first step and can't be the last step. You need to be able to scale this to broad-based strikes as necessary, and candidly be prepared to scale it up all the way till putting ground troops on the ground. I mean, you put yourself in a precarious situation by ruling anything out and not being prepared to take the next steps to follow that up. But certainly we've seen that airstrikes can be effective and as part of a broader strategy, one tool that you can use.
Paul, what do you think?
I think it's important when we talk about defeating ISIL that it's both the military and a political solution. We can destroy some of their American-made equipment that they captured from our Iraqi allies. But if we really want to destroy ISIL, we have to destroy them politically. And this means we have to essentially take away their reason for being, and you have to have territory secured by the Kurdish forces or by the Syrian opposition, where you can begin a process of democratic transformation. That's the only thing that's going to take the steam out of ISIL. And I think that's where the American government has to be honest with the American people. This isn't an air war. This is an air war until we degrade their capacity. And then it's a destroy them war where we use our allies and as well as other military assets to destroy them. And then to keep them from coming back, like whack-a-mole, where they pop up, you actually have to have a political process on the ground in the absence of conflict. That's a long and arduous process that we're embarking upon.
Well, does law, international or domestic, have any role to play in all of this? Or is this just, we've got a threat, we respond? So let's talk with Milena, our international law expert. Now, under international law, as I understand it, a country can use force in the territory of another only in 3 situations. One is with consent, and nobody here is consenting. Well, I guess Iraq potentially is consenting, but not Syria. But number 2, the Security Council can authorize, and we haven't seen any Security Council resolutions authorizing force. And number 3 is self-defense. So what are the justifications that the Obama administration are relying on, Milena?
So the Obama administration has asserted several different legal justifications. Domestically speaking, they have asserted this rationale that a law called the Authorization to Use Military Force, which is a federal statute passed in the wake of 9/11.
So in 2002?
In 2000, at the end of
2001.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is a law that essentially authorizes the president to combat those groups that were responsible for the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001.
So literally under that theory, we could invade any country where al-Qaeda is operating?
Yeah, we've seen this a little bit with our policy of targeted killings or drone strikes, where we essentially have made this argument that wherever these terrorists are, we can strike.
And now we can actually do not just pinpoint strikes, as I said, with Predator drones, but massive carpet bombing and Tomahawk cruise missiles?
Well, the Obama administration rationale has been that ISIL, because it's an outgrowth of al-Qaeda, and the president was authorized by this law back in 2001, 2002 to fight al-Qaeda, it follows then that the president is also authorized today to fight ISIL because they are basically a continuation, succession of al-Qaeda.
Okay.
Now, the other option, obviously, for the president would be to go to Congress and obtain authorization to use military force from our Congress.
There was a congressional authorization last week, but it wasn't to use force in Syria, was it?
No, this is actually a different kind of. So what's interesting is that this is a bipartisan, authorization to a president. This doesn't happen very often, so I think this is significant. This is essentially authorization to work with the Syrian moderates to train them.
That's all Congress authorized.
It is not authorization to use ground troops in Syria or Iraq. But again, the administration position is that the president, because of this 2001, 2002 law, does not need new authorization to use military force in Iraq and Syria. And then from the standpoint of international law, your argument about self-defense, I think Iraq and Syria pose two different scenarios. I think with respect to Iraq, you can make this argument of collective self-defense, that the moderate Shiite and Kurdish, government in Iraq has essentially invited the United States to help self-defend against the Islamic State. And then for Syria,
but
obviously.
Can that argument be, not only do you come into our territory, but these guys are going across the border and hiding, so you have to defeat them over there too in order to defend us here in Iraq?
Well, respect, so if you're crossing into, for example, Syrian territory, I think the argument there is a little bit different. And there, I think the argument is that there are these non-state actors, these terrorist groups like the ISIL. They're harming the United States from Syria, and Syria is a state that is unable or unwilling to effectively fight them, and that because of that, we can make this self-defense argument and go and fight them across the Syrian border.
How are the rest of the world and the countries at the UN dealing with this rationale? Are they accepting it?
Well, so it's interesting that you mentioned the United Nations, and you said, one of the instances in which under international law states can use force is with Security Council authorization. I think it's extremely unlikely that Russia or China, two big veto power countries, would ever, agree to this. But we have other, Western democratic allies, such as, for example, France. France has already started to participate in this air campaign, and, the UK has express some, essentially, at least theoretical agreement that this is the right thing to do.
The UK is a little bit in the bind because 2 years ago, when it turned out that Assad was using chemical weapons, their parliament voted that they would prohibit the government from intervening.
Yes.
And although this isn't still about toppling Assad or stopping the chemical weapons, it's still intervening in Syria. So
I mean, I think the problem today is that for the UK, for the United States domestically too, for our president, is that I think the people of the United States, the people of the UK, just don't really have the willingness to fight another war in the Middle East with ground forces and with the risk that carries to American and British lives. And so I think that the leadership, here President Obama, and then in the UK certainly David Cameron, I think they're trying to essentially persuade the public that this might be the right thing to do when most of the at least some of the people in the US and the UK see this as just yet another war in the Middle East.
And maybe they're concerned about the slippery slope phenomenon too, because while I can understand all those arguments applying to ISIL, isn't it true that the first targets weren't even ISIL? They were al-Nusra, that's the other al-Qaeda group that ISIL fights against in Syria, and also this other group that I hadn't really ever heard of before, but it's the Khorasan terrorist group that's also operating in Syria.
Yeah, so these are basically, I think Sandy mentioned this earlier in the program, that basically it almost seems like there are these splinter terrorist cells in particularly in Syria that might be vying for control, in Syria. And this really, I think, feeds into Paul's point earlier that basically, when Syrian President Assad started, doing harmful, horrible things to the Syrian population, it really allowed for the growth of these kinds of terrorist groups. And so, al-Nusra and the Khorasan, they're just al-Qaeda terrorist.
So it's all
type
fair
groups.
Game under this legal justification.
Under the legal justification that the United States has asserted, it would be fair game, yes, as long as there's this threat and as long as a state is unable or unwilling to fight these terrorist non-state actors.
So let's go back to Sandy. You were describing, Sandy, how you think this is going to start ramping up. Is it possible that this air campaign will evolve into the enforcement of a full all-out no-fly zone like they had in Iraq 2 decades ago and like they had in Libya?
Well, look, I can't predict which direction exactly that the administration will take this. I mean, I certainly agree with the notion that these limited airstrikes are not going to be effective for long enough with an organization and enemy that is this well armed and this well equipped, this well trained, and this motivated. And that goes across borders, which is candidly a challenge for us in managing, even as we work with the Iraqi government with their consent and trying to work without the consent of the Syrian government and without working with them or with their opposition. So I think that this will continue to grow. I think that we will have to move to another stage. If I can predict whether it will be a full airstrike corridor, no-fly zone, or how far a U.S.-led coalition without a UN Security Council resolution will go, will be interesting to see. But certainly we need to be prepared to step this up a notch and to work with other international allies to make that happen, with or without the ability to use the UN Security Council.
Well, that's a good segue to the second of the 3 things that Milena said are part of the Obama plan. So let's look at the surrogate ground force issue. This is, in fact, how the United States was able to topple the Taliban in Afghanistan and the government of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. But let me ask you guys, maybe starting with Paul, is the Iraqi army a good surrogate partner? It has 250,000 troops, but are they appropriately trained and motivated to fight this war with us?
No.
Tell me how you really feel, Paul.
We've had a week of, we've had over a decade of training with the Iraqi army. When 30,000 Iraqi troops were facing 800 ISIL militants in Mosul, the 30,000 fled and the 800 took over Mosul. That's how they captured most of the military equipment that they now have. The core of the current Iraqi army that we're relying on are Iranian-backed Shia militia. They're basically volunteers. They're the militia that we fought for years in Iraq, and now they're our allies. It's going to be very difficult to rely upon them. I think where we really need to put our energy and our resources are in the Kurds and in the Syrian opposition Free Syrian Army.
Okay, and the Kurds have been pretty together. They've got their act together. They have their autonomous area. They've been probably the only entity in Iraq that hasn't had infighting. So, Paul, you're suggesting they would be the best partner in Iraq, and they'll probably come out of it as the biggest winners too. Is that right?
Well, they're very pro-American. We have a long tradition of working very closely with them, protecting their interests and having them protect our interests. Unfortunately, we've starved them for ammunition and equipment over the last decade. As we've sought to build up the Iraqi forces, we've really minimized our engagement with the Kurds. That's changed in these last 3 weeks, but they're a very under-resourced ally. And I think we need to be serious, and we need to be honest, and we need to place our bet on the Kurds and on the Free Syrian Army and do it aggressively and manage the Iraqi army, but really work with the Kurds and the Free Syrian Army.
All right, and let me ask Shannon about the other side of the border. We're supposed to be partnering with the fighters against the government. I guess they're called the opposition forces. And they're supposed to stop their fight against the Assad government and turn around and defeat the ISIL. First of all, how do we know who the good guys are in all of this? And what are their capabilities as surrogates?
I mean, I'm going to be as blunt as Paul. We don't. And I'm also going to be honest that when I first read about us deciding to arm the rebels in this way, my initial reaction was, oh, because that's never gone wrong. I mean, the trouble is we have a history of arming rebels that isn't a happy one when you look long term. And it isn't just because of the groups that we choose. It's actually arguably more because of what we do next. And the U.S. has a very appalling track record of arming groups to solve short-term problems and then withdrawing from them after those immediate issues are resolved and leaving those groups often in difficult situations with their own ends to try to develop goals which then end up counter to U.S. interests.
I mean, I'm reminded by the fact that al-Qaeda and the Taliban began when we armed them against Russia in Afghanistan in the 1970s.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I found myself thinking about, of course, Charlie Wilson and, you know, the wonderful quote, which I have to paraphrase to not say things I can't say on the radio. But he said, you know, these things were glorious and they changed the world. And then we fumbled the end game. You know, we helped make more bad guys.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop for another short break. When we return, our experts will continue the critique of the Obama plan for defeating the ISIL. Please stay with us. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by Sandy Hodgkinson and Paul Williams in Washington, D.C., and Shannon French and Milena Stereo at the WCPN Idea Stream studio here in Cleveland. We've been talking about President Obama's plan to defeat the Islamic State militant group known as ISIL. And Milena had told us that there were 3 prongs to that plan, and now I want to turn to the third of those. That's this coalition that the United States is trying to build. Milena, who are they, and what type of assistance is the United States looking for?
Sure. So in the military strikes which we have already launched against these ISIL targets, 5 Middle Eastern Arab nations have already helped us. And these nations are Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain. There are other nations, however, that have also expressed their willingness to help us in other ways. So, for example, countries like Australia, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, Turkey, Egypt, they have all indicated a willingness to help us in other ways, such as, for example, provide humanitarian assistance, provide, media type assistance. Some Arab countries like Egypt were going to broadcast news and programs basically saying negative things, horrible things about the ISIL. Canada has stated they will provide equipment and ammunition. So there certainly is, some form of a global willingness to help us in various ways in this effort.
I think one of the things they're really going to have to help with is when you do all this bombing, you create massive flows of refugees. People are fleeing from the disaster.
Yes.
So somebody has to help pay for, feed, keep those people and hope that they don't become their own destabilizing
And I think
threat.
that's why the Obama administration has tried to engage regional countries, and that is why, for example, assistance from Turkey, for example, I think would be key if they would at least provide humanitarian relief and allow for refugees to come in.
Yeah. Well, Shannon, they say wars and politics make strange bedfellows. So what's the prospect that the battle against the ISIL will bring Iran into this coalition?
Well, I think that Iran is quite likely to come in, but it would be handled very gingerly. It would not be a formal alliance. I think what you would see is an informal coalition that would be carefully managed through backdoor means and negotiations through allies. I think what we will not see is working with Syria. That has already been ruled out by the U.S. and the U.K., for example. And I think, I don't know if you would agree, Melina, but that's not going to occur.
Yeah, I mean, and I understand President Assad said, "Oh, we'll work with you. We'll help you solve
No,
this problem."
thank you.
And they said a big no, thank you. But with respect to Iran, this may also be affecting our negotiations in their nuclear disarmament because they think that we now need something more from them, and now they think they have an extra card to play. Is that right?
Well, let me take it back to this point about understanding Middle Eastern politics, because I think the concern that not everyone always understands about what is being managed by the leadership in these countries is a very tricky balance between internal and external politics. If you are seen to be working with the U.S., you're going to have enormous problems domestically. So any kinds of deals that are going to be made or partnerships do have to be made in these backdoor ways that allow a certain plausible deniability, so you don't look like you're a puppet of the U.S. or following there. And I have to say, some of the language that we use in the U.S. doesn't help with that. If we sound patronizing or imperialistic, this doesn't help in getting them the language they need to convince people. Did you think that
President Obama struck the right tone in his speech at the UN yesterday or recently?
I'm not sure about that. I think I'm not sure he got the right tone, and I think that's exactly the worry that a lot of people have, that as long as we still sound as though we are offering to save places, that is going to create the kind of tension and offense. And there's a lot of involvement that we are getting, a lot of help we are getting, particularly on the intelligence side. And if that's not acknowledged sufficiently, it also sounds as if we don't appreciate the partnerships that already exist.
So I read this amazing quote from Thomas Friedman as a critique of the Obama plan. Let me actually read this and then ask for all of you to respond. Friedman says, quote, "Our staying power is ambiguous, our enemy is barbarous, our regional allies are duplicitous, our European allies are feckless, and the Iraqis and Syrians that we're trying to help are fractious." He goes on to say, "There is not a straight shooter in the bunch." All right, expert panel. Is that a valid criticism? Starting with Shannon.
Well, I'm just going to jump in. I have a lot of European friends, and I have to say that idea of European allies are feckless. Why wouldn't they say the same back to us? We have our disappearing red lines.
Oh, yeah.
We have our leading from behind in Libya. And even the West Point speech that President Obama made that sounded like he wanted to jump back to early isolationism. I think it bothers me that Friedman would characterize it that way without acknowledging that it
surprise,
flows
France is
both ways.
flying the bombing runs right alongside of us.
And
right?
I'm actually going to point out even earlier in your own language, you talked about us toppling in Libya. Really? That wasn't just us. We had a few other people actually carrying the bigger load there. So,
Paul, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah. I agree with Shannon. The European allies are feckless.
I think that's a disagreement.
That's what I said.
Go ahead, Paul. Tell us what you think.
Michael, the reality is this is the hand we're dealt. And I think he's being honest. And what's refreshing about that is there's a lot of papering over reality. There are a lot of folks who are talking about, well, maybe we need to partner with the Iranians, partner with the Syrians. Look, the reason we have this problem is you have Iran. You draw an arrow to Iraq. You draw an arrow to Syria and what's happening there, and you draw an area to Hezbollah. It's this Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Hezbollah axis which has led to killing 200,000 civilians in Syria, which led to the growth of ISIL. So before we start bantering around, hey, look, we can't rely upon our European allies, et cetera, let's partner up with Iranians, or hey, Assad from Syria is key. No, you cannot go there. So you are left with our feckless European allies, our under-resourced Kurdish allies, and our, rather fractious Syrian opposition allies. We've missed a window to pull together the Syrian opposition. We've missed a window to build upon, dare I say, French leadership in Europe to do something here.
Paul, I want to follow up with you because we haven't talked much about who the Syrian opposition are, who these good guys are that we're going to partner with. You actually have done a lot of work, legal work, for the Syrian opposition. Can you tell us about them?
Yes. The Syrian opposition, we've provided legal assistance to them in their negotiations in Geneva. So we've had an opportunity to meet them up close and personal. And they are literally the average Joes from Syria, people who have been forced to take up weapons to defend their family, their villages. They are not an organized military force. They're people who are fighting to keep their families, their way of life, from being destroyed both by the government of Syria and by the supercharged al-Qaeda, ISIL. They have a long way to go to be transformed into an effective military force. We've missed an opportunity of these past 3 years to help them transform, but they've been phenomenal in basically scraping together what military resources they can to defend their home territory. They have, you can, just as much as you can criticize their organization, their military skill. President Obama calls them dentists and farmers. George Washington was a farmer. These are the people that we're relying on and that have the real commitment. Just as ISIL is committed to doing us harm, these individuals are committed to protecting their territory and to fighting the good fight, and we need to ally with them. As they are.
That may be the first positive note of this whole conversation. Milena, you wanted to weigh in on the Friedman quote.
On the Friedman quote, yes, because I think this is an incredibly difficult situation because on the one hand, we have a juxtaposition of al-Qaeda on the one hand and then Shiite states like Iran and Syria on the other. So when you talk about partnering with any of them, it seems really, not the best thing to do. That's one problem. Another problem is that we have these states like Iraq and Syria. We have multiple ethnic groups living together. And in some instances, we've had, brutal dictators who on the one hand are horrible, but on the other hand are holding the country together, like Saddam Hussein did for years in Iraq. And so then we remove a leader like that, and then basically chaos ensues. And so I think that's extremely difficult. And I think part of our hesitation in Syria has been not to repeat another Iraq. And so just going back to something that Paul said earlier, I think the key here is to build up a political coalition among these groups. And so I worry a little bit when we start singling out groups like, the Syrian moderates. If they're only, 10% of the population, they might be the best guys in the world, but they can't hold the country together on their own. And so I do think that going back to Paul's earlier point, I think the key really is building up a political society and somehow getting participation, finding moderates in all the groups, not just one.
So if I had to ask you to crystal ball, and they are able at some point to defeat the ISIL, do you see also Assad's regime crumbling, or does this strengthen the Assad regime?
If we let's say that we defeat the ISIL in Syria, I think, yes, there is certainly a danger that the Assad regime would be strengthened. So I think part of our strategy, and I think Paul was saying this too, I think has to be somehow transitioning the Assad regime out of power. Now, of course, that's easier said than done, but I think we have to be extremely careful, because I think if we topple ISIL in Syria, I think there's a huge danger that the Assad regime would be strengthened.
Now, let me return to Sandy. I know you didn't want to go here, but I need to ask you this question. If you're going to be practical about this, don't you think in the end we're going to have to put boots on the ground?
I do think that.
Yeah.
I recognize that when you build a campaign and you build support for something, it's a lot easier to start with a little bit and grow from there and raise awareness and understanding of the threat that we face. But look, Iraq and Syria are critical to the United States' security, and making sure that they remain stable enough, and whether that stable future involves Assad or not is a part of the discussion. But nonetheless, we need some stability there. And considering, I think, we all agree that airstrikes alone at this point aren't going to do it. We need to have a sustained campaign, a sustained effort towards this. And at some point, I think the U.S. will end up committing its own troops, certainly if the other methods don't turn out to be successful.
Is that, Sandy, going to take new congressional authorization either under the War Powers Act or just to get funding?
I think so. I mean, look, I consider to believe that, any continuing use of the AUMF from 2001 to groups that weren't, tied in any way to 9/11 is a risk. I mean, I think it's less than optimal. I think there could be challenges in a court at some point, and so it makes more sense to get something that is more appropriately tailored, even if that includes sunset clauses and other ways to cabin it so that you don't look like you're seeking never-ending authority. Even the authorization for use of military force in Iraq from 2002 at least had something talking about the threat of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so you begin to see some authority there. So you could seek a AUMF that is really focused principally on today's threats of ISIL and any other groups that you seek to include. But in my view, it certainly makes sense to go back and at least have this conversation with Congress.
Well, Sandy, how long do you think that this battle against the ISIL is going to last?
I think it's going to last a while. I wish I could say that our quick, decisive action was going to rout it out, but I don't see that as an immediate end game here. And given all of the political work that needs to be done, which you've heard today from several of our other speakers, it's going to take time. And so there's plenty of time for us to have debates about this. But what's most important is that the president and his executive, team here in the executive branch works closely with Congress to make sure that they get the authorization they need, have a plan that's sustainable, and work with their allies to begin executing it. Because the longer we wait, the harder it will be to achieve.
Well, let me ask our experts then about the domestic politics. I know there have been some opinion polls, and one said the American people are overwhelmingly in favor of airstrikes. They just love them. But when they ask the question about boots on the ground, the American people are overwhelmingly against. Shannon, do you think that's going to change over time? Or is this going to mean that the Obama administration is going to have a lot of trouble getting congressional authorization?
I think it's going to mean they're going to have a lot of trouble getting authorization. And I think this lack of domestic political will for boots on the ground, you could argue that there's simply political cowardice going on in Congress. They're not willing to make the case for it. They're checking first to see if their constituents are in favor of something and then just going along with that. That's not leadership. I'm not taking my own stand on this, but if you do feel that boots on the ground are the way that you should go, then that case needs to be made by Congress and by the president. And we're not hearing that. They're just checking the temperature of the country.
And I mean, it might be, I mean, I think I agree with Sandy that I think boots on the ground are the next step. And so it might be that the president is now, this is sort of a first introductory measure, these airstrikes. And then it might be that, in a few months we start using boots on the ground. But I think, as Shannon said, I think the president, even though I think he should be working with Congress, I think because he has faced so much opposition on other things, and because things have been very difficult between our executive and legislative branches over the last 7-8 years, I think that he's just skeptical of going to Congress to ask for authorization to use military force. And then now he's in this position where he's using the 2001 law, the authorization to use military force, and making this stretchy legal argument to say that ISIL is really exactly like Al-Qaeda when they're not, and when the proper legal position would be to go back to Congress, I think.
And Sandy said there could be court cases. How would that work? Who would bring such a case?
Well, I mean, whoever has standing under the law. But you could have essentially congressmen going and going to a court and basically saying that this is a unconstitutional way that the president is using his powers.
Could they raise it as an impeachment issue?
I mean, I don't think it's likely politically, but I guess anything is possible.
Well, let me jump in here because obviously as you move to a bigger military campaign and, we would get to a point where you would either, be killing or capturing members of the opposition, assuming that you are actually killing and or capturing people. The moment that you capture someone, we do have a situation where these hearings, in the case of some of the detainees we've been holding over the past several years, have challenged the legality of that in federal court. And if they challenge the legality of a particular group of people fitting under this authorization for the use of military force, a federal court judge may well determine that ISIL is outside of the scope of that somewhat temporally limited 9/11 authority.
Well, Sandy, we're coming to the end of our broadcast.
It's an attenuated way of getting there.
So it looks like we're standing on the edge of another protracted war. The stakes are incredibly high. And our experts are telling us that we may be getting ourselves into another quagmire, and there may be a lot of litigation as well. If you want to weigh in on the discussion or suggest a topic for an upcoming broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, please send an email to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. Thank you again to our panelists of experts, former Assistant Secretary of Defense Sandy Hodgkinson, Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Professor Milena Stereo from Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and Dr. Shannon French from the Inamori Center for Ethics and Excellence. I'm Michael Scharf, and you've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.
Talking Foreign Policy is a production of Case Western Reserve University and is produced in partnership with 90.3 FM WCPN Idea Stream. Questions and comments about the topics discussed on the show, or to suggest future topics, go to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. That's Talking Foreign Policy, all one word, @case.edu.